You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Health Podcast, and I have Dr. Laura Jana. She's a pediatrician. She's also the author of a book called The Toddler Brain, and we're going to have a good conversation today. So, Dr. Jana or Laura, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. Good to join you.
Yeah, so tell me, you're a pediatrician, but it sounds like you're specialized. What's the focus of your work, in the medical industry? What led you to writing this book on the toddler brain?
Sure. Well, interestingly, in my background, I come from the hard sciences world, cellular molecular biology and neurosciences. And then, obviously, as a pediatrician, I decided to focus on children, partly because I love children. I kind of the whole age range, but also because I tend to be sort of a root cause person. Like if we're really going to make a difference in people's lives, and, certainly for children, what we do to make them healthy and keep them well, serves them throughout their lifetime. And I also like to tackle challenges in a practical sense. So from a practical sense, helping parents and anyone caring for children figure out how to do that well is my broad area of focus. With respect to the toddler brain, I then started to tackle what's going on in the world today, what are challenges for parents, and how can I help? And that can span from everything from technology use to getting kids to brush their teeth, and certainly getting them to learn how to sleep well. So again, it kind of covers the spectrum.
So in regards to kids, I guess, I have kids, so I guess when they were toddlers, it was a difficult time because you can talk to them, but they kind of, they're not able to speak back, or they'll speak in one or two words, and they're fussy and they're wriggly and they want to do all kinds of stuff, and they get tired and then they throw tantrums. So, what's unique or specific about toddlers that you've learned, and what are some of the challenges people have?
Well, you sort of set that one up really well in your comments, because you've got a couple things at play there. You've got kids who are starting to become independent, right? Toddlers are now up and toddling and getting into things and active, but they're also at a developmental stage. And this is where I spend a good bit of my time kind of helping people understand what is normal development, what can you normally expect kids to do, or what should you not expect them to do at a certain age. And as you said, we know toddlers may say one or maybe two words together, but they certainly don't communicate well enough to explain themselves when they're tired or cranky or fussy. And they also lack a bit of self-awareness. So they're less likely, some adults do too, but toddlers lack the self-awareness to say, oh, you know what, I'm having this meltdown because I'm just so tired that I really probably should go to sleep early tonight. That just doesn't happen. So that's where you it's almost like a perfect storm if you're not aware of what to expect and how to work with that. And part of that is understanding what's typical, like how much sleep do toddlers need. And the other is how to work with them to help them learn those healthy habits when they may not be aware of it themselves.
So what are some misconceptions people have about toddlers? Let's start with, how long do they need to sleep? And, what other misconceptions cause friction between them and the parents?
Sure. Well, one of the biggest ones, and so, every kid is different in terms of how much sleep they need. But honestly, and I always, my general parenting philosophy is never say never and never say always. But for the most part, I have yet to meet a toddler who doesn't need a really good long nap, if not still 2 naps a day. Okay, so either that one nicely formed, afternoon nap, or they might still, if they're closer to 1, they might still be doing 2 naps a day. One of the mistakes that parents often make as kids get into that 1 to 2, maybe 3-year-old age range is that they assume that because their child, for example, doesn't take a nap, resists going to sleep, doesn't fall asleep when you try to get them to take a nap, that they don't need it anymore. And especially in kids 3 and under. 4, you start to get some kids who may not, or they may sleep a nice long time at night. But it's pretty clear cut that kids, toddlers absolutely do. And when you make that mistake and think that they don't need it anymore, not only does that mean that they end up short on sleep overall, but that makes them crankier and more resistant to things. And they actually sometimes have a harder time falling asleep at night because they're overly tired. And that's the irony, that adds to the pain of all of it, is the kids who most need sleep sometimes have the least ability to get themselves to go and lay down to go to sleep.
Yeah, I've heard advice of, babies or toddlers can self-soothe. And do you think that's good advice or bad advice? It doesn't seem like, how would they have the skills to self-soothe? It seems like they need help.
Yeah, and this is where, first of all, every child is different. So, of course, we all as parents hear about the other parent who is so fortunate that they have a child who just goes right to sleep and sleeps through the night by, 3 months of age, and just wonderful sleeper. And that's great, right? Because that they know how to self-soothe and they never really have a problem. But what I'll add to what you say is, it's important to think of helping a child learn how to self-soothe. So it's not something that we're all just naturally good at doing. And so I like to start with all parents by saying, think of learning to fall asleep independently and sleep through the night or take your naps as a learning process. And some people get it with, some kids do great right off the bat. And for all the rest of the kids, you can then help set the conditions, right? Set up a bedtime routine, recognize that if the kids can learn to fall asleep early, like when they're infants, you can rock them and be caring, but you also want to say, listen, if you can lay your infant down and they just sort of look at their mobile and they just sort of lay there for a while and they kick their feet around and then they fall asleep, don't interfere, right? Because that ability, recognize that as a big step in the right direction. If they can learn to fall asleep independently, then it really increases the odds of a good night's sleep, of being a good napper, and all those other things that we all aim for.
So what are some unique phenomena to toddlers versus babies versus kids that are a little bit older that parents need help with or the kids need help with?
Sure. One of the interesting things about toddlers, and you brought this up with their inability to really express themselves, infants and toddlers, I like to describe something like, let's say, going to the grocery store, going to the library, an outing, like an activity, can feel for a very young child like a day at the amusement park. And if you or I think about how we feel after a really stimulating, exciting, challenging day, whatever it is, again, we may be the most tired and in the most need of sleep, and we may have the most difficulty falling asleep. For toddlers, what's sort of unique to them is they can't express themselves. They certainly are going to challenge you, and they're also at a stage where it's their job to challenge you, right? I mean, I would say it's a young child's job to test your limits. In fact, it's all children's jobs to test your limits as a parent. If you say it's time to go to bed or something, it's your job to set some limits. So that's the other thing about that age, is that is the age of budding independence. And independence means that if you tell me it's time for me to go to sleep, I'm going to say, no, it's not. I don't want to go to sleep. I'm not tired. Or you might not even say it because you're a toddler who doesn't speak in full sentences yet, but you might resist it. That's somewhat unique. I mean, when you get to older kids, they may push back or say they don't want to, but that's a completely different discussion than a toddler who doesn't have, sort of what we would call the good sense to know that they need to sleep and then go along with it and kind of work on it on their own. You really have to work on making it a positive routine, kind of be firm about it, but be supportive, not as in I'm angry because you won't go to sleep, but how can I make this happen? I'm going to support you, but we all are in agreement you need to go to sleep.
Well, what chronotype do toddlers have? Because I've heard that, teenagers, they're just simply not geared to get up early morning. And so, the time school starts for them is just not conducive. So you're going to get a lot of resistance and a lot of grogginess and problems. How about toddlers? I see a lot of parents that want to put them to bed, for the night at like 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock, and maybe that doesn't work for them. I don't know.
Great question. You're hitting on something that a lot of parents actually don't always pick up on, but obviously as somebody who follows this professionally, it's really intriguing to take into account or to be aware of how sleep cycles not only play into this, making it harder or easier to sleep at a certain time of day or night, but also how they change with age. And we sort of know this intuitively, right? Because you just described a typical pattern. A 1 or 2 year old or even a 3 or 4 year old, it's not uncommon to have them have what we consider as adults really early bedtimes, right? 7 or 8 p.m.
Right.
And then we see, and the irony is those are the kids who oftentimes, because they're young, they have later start, kindergarten, later school times, right? Because we say they're young and the school buses pick up the high school kids and then the middle school kids and then the elementary school kids so that you have them come in later. When it's ironic because they're the ones who tend to go to bed earlier and wake up earlier, and teenagers, naturally by their cycles and sleep cycles tend to go to sleep much later. And if they have an early start time, that's really that we see that. The other thing that's really pretty striking and worth noting is that we think of, I often get asked how many hours, so you've got your newborn sleep and then your 1-year-old and then your 2-year-old, what are typical patterns. But when we're talking toddlers, we're talking 10 to 13 hours a night. Right? And sometimes, you factor in your naps as they get older so that cumulative sleep in the day, in a full day, in full 24 hours. That drops down, right? As you get into elementary school and middle school, the amount of sleep that kids need drops down. What's interesting and often missed by parents is that then you see this pick back up again in terms of the amount of sleep that kids heading into the teenage years need. And again, the problem at that age is that they will tell you they think they know best already. It's not that they just aren't communicative, but they think they know enough to know that they don't need sleep when they really do. And those sleep needs go way back up again. So it's like a U shape. You start with a lot of sleep needs, infancy, toddlerhood. It decreases and then it goes right back up again in those teen years.
Yeah, and by the teen years, they're able to fight you and argue with you. Throw tantrums.
Right.
Now they're like gigantic
in
toddlers.
some ways it's the same, right? It's almost like, but in some ways it's different. And of course, in all of this, talking about technology, one of the things that now has become a discussion across all ages, all the way down to infants, is screen use. And there's really interesting studies about, first of all, the amount of time spent on screens can just by sheer use of time mean that you're getting less sleep because you're spending that time on a computer, on a screen, on an iPad, whatever it might be. But there's also factors like, blue light exposure, right? Where if you're exposed to the light from your screens, which is why there's now, for example, a night mode on an iPhone or an iPad, that's
right.
to get rid of the type of light that actually interferes, as the research suggests that it interferes with sleep cycles, so that you can throw off the natural cues. Because remember, from sort of a big picture standpoint, we're all sort of wired to be awake during daylight and be asleep at night. And if we fake out our bodies and our sleep cycles to think that it's daytime when it's, midnight, but we're under the covers with an iPad, right? That does not do good things for sleep cycles. And so as that evidence evolves, it's already clear it's a bad idea on multiple levels to have kids going to sleep with screens, and also to be using them even within, a certain period of time before bedtime, or excessive use that's displacing hours that would have been spent sleeping.
Yeah, when I was little, I would stay up with like a flashlight and read books, when I was 8, 9, 10, and then into teen years. But now, if I was back at this time, I would have used an iPad or a phone, and you're right, the blue light would have been much more disruptive than paper and, a candle.
Yes, and it's interesting because as somebody who I've spent decades promoting early literacy, right, and I'm all about books at bedtime. It's actually a different discussion. Your brain is engaged differently when you're talking about what you're describing, which is the flashlight. Which, first of all, the light's not shining in your face, right? It's at the book, and books are engaging, but they're not engaging in the same way where today's technology is, where it's, a lot of what kids are looking at, because they're not always reading, right? It's not like every kid is sitting in bed under the covers reading a book on their iPad, right? They're playing games or watching something. Those things are oftentimes designed. Like the purpose of the design is to capture and hold your child's attention. And in fact, it's been said, one of the tech titans, when the CEOs of the big tech companies said that their biggest competitors were YouTube, Netflix, and sleep. Because what competes for attention? They're all competing. And that tells you if you're asleep, then they're losing the battle. So they're going to create things on the technology side that you would do oversleeping. And that's a serious problem. And in fact, I'm a spokesperson for the American Academy of Pediatrics. And this is where the AAP, we've really put a lot of time and thought into this as we're doing this, what some people consider a massive experiment on children. This generation of children growing up with technology, on what is this doing to If they're falling asleep drinking, they now have that as an association with falling asleep. It's not nutritional necessity for, again, not every now and then there's a child who needs to, but for most 1-year-olds, they don't need to drink as they're falling asleep to get enough of the nutrition they need. Now it's become a crutch. It's their way of falling asleep that they don't do well without it. That's what I mean when I say it's sort of like you sleuth out what are the factors. Well, if it's, falling asleep drinking, then what if after you give your baby the breast or the bottle, you then do your bath time, right? Because now your baby's going to be awake. And then maybe you make books, your cue, but maybe the last book of the night, you have your baby in the crib or your toddler in the bed and say, okay, the last one I'm going to sit here, I'll read it, but you kind of get to lay down. And then they learn to be calm and quiet, but not. And then you go. That's the kind of thing that you want to focus on, is how do you help have kids learn how to do that independent sleeping.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. What is, you still want to put your kid to sleep. So when is it bedtime ritual and when is it encouraging a behavior that stops them from sleeping on their own?
Well, the ritual I typically recommend, okay, and I've included this. I've written several books, actually, and this is included in most of them. I wrote a book called Heading Home with Your Newborn, From Birth to Reality. And the thing about books about newborns is a lot of what you do when your child is very young can set the stage, right? You can't expect them to master everything when they're, a few months old, but you can set the stage for what's going to make it easier later on. Okay, so a healthy bedtime routine, even when children are really young, and like I said, a newborn needs to breastfeed every 2 hours, right? So chances are they're going to fall asleep while they're breastfeeding. But if you start to get into a routine, I am partial to the breast or bottle for the infants who are, the young kids who are still doing that, or, whatever they're going to drink before at the end of the night, then doing the bath and brushing teeth, right? So you get your hygiene routine in there. I just finished today writing a blog about getting kids to brush their teeth. And the earlier you start making that a routine, you can start before kids have teeth, and it's still a worthwhile exercise, right? And then you say, and then books. And because there's so much value to kids, not just learning to read, but learning to love to read, the shared experience of making bedtime the time to read books together. And it can be 1, it can be 3, it can be I'll read some and then I'll leave some for you, which is a really good trick, by the way, for the kid who says they don't need to nap in childcare, for example, where they're required to lay down for a nap. Say, well, I can't make you fall asleep, but why don't we do this? We'll give you a bunch of books and you can lay on your cot, right? And half the kids, at least, who say they don't need a nap, fall asleep within minutes. They've got a nice, quiet activity, not disrupting anybody else. You've now encouraged book reading. So that routine of making whatever the last meal or drink of the day is going to be, then separating it, right? So you do your bath or your brushing teeth sort of routine, and then you make books your cue. And again, it's just your goal isn't to rock your child to sleep with a book until you are absolutely certain they're snoring and sound asleep. It's you make it nice and quiet, you set the mood, everybody calms down even if you had an active day, and then you get to separate while they're still awake, but in a nice mode where they can now learn to fall asleep independently.
Well, is there anything wrong with staying with them until they're asleep, or does that create the necessity of you being there?
I've seen plenty of kids who that's been their routine and it's not a problem, right? They sleep well, they sleep through the night, that's fine. What tends to happen, though, is that whether it's rocking them to sleep, reading them to sleep, feeding them to sleep, that lots of times it catches parents off guard because for a while it works, right? Let's say for, a 6-month-old. And then all of a sudden at 9 months, that child, and sometimes it's when they discover, for example, a 9-month-old who discovers how to pull themselves up in a crib, and now they're wide awake. And what happens is they're wide awake, and now they don't know how to get back to sleep again without what they had when they went to sleep the first time, whatever that may be. And this is where you can fill in the blank, because for some kids, they were driven around the block in their car seat. And for some kids, they were rocked or held or, fed or whatever it is. So I tend to err on the side of, listen, I am all for the warm attachment, time spent together, cuddling, holding your child on your lap. But there is that opportunity when they're getting tired to say, okay, well, here, I'm going to put you down. I'm going to read. We can read one more book. I'll leave you with some books if the child doesn't want to be, left without. Here's a couple board books for you, and you can keep them with you, right? Because if they fall asleep with them, they're still safe, right? And then you don't run the risk of them then becoming dependent later on. Some kids never do, but I see a lot of kids where you think it's fine, like it's not my problem. Like other kids have the problem, but mine doesn't. and then it becomes a problem, and you have to sort of retrain them to be able to fall asleep independently later on.
Yeah, ours, my son, we had to drive a certain route, and he would fall asleep at the same time every night, and then that stopped, and then, they seem to go through phases with that kind of stuff, but for a while, that's what we relied on. So.
Sure, and this is where I've really spent a lot of time making sure that I'm all about practical parenting. And so when I say all this, I always have to say, listen, the reason I focus on these things is not because I'm telling parents what they do wrong. It makes perfect sense why we do what we do, right? If we want our kids to sleep and they're not, we do what we can. And if it works, we do it. But sometimes it's a short-term fix. And then there are ways to do it where it's a long-term fix, right? And so, it's certainly there are times, and I always use the example of when a kid gets sick, right? So if your, 2 or 3-year-old comes in your room and they say they're not feeling good and you feel their forehead and then you take their temperature and, oh, yes, they've got a fever and all, and you want them, they've learned to sleep independently, but now they want to come and get in bed with you. And I've got parents who say, I don't want that to happen. I don't want them to be dependent on sleeping with me, but they're sick. You make your choice, right? Because it's a short-term thing. And I did have one of my 3 children always wanted to sleep with us when he got sick. He'd get very high fevers, just, sort of by fluke, nothing more serious. But he'd get high fevers. He was uncomfortable. He'd come in our room. And my husband and I knew for a fact that it was going to take us like 2 weeks to get him extracted from our room after he was better again. Okay? But we still decided to do it, right? He was sick. I'm a pediatrician. My husband's a doctor. We wanted to keep an eye on him. So that is where you make your choices. What I like to do is make it so that parents aren't falling into a trap, right? That they weren't aware that was a problem, because we all make our choices. And see, at the time, we were like, well, that's well worth it because we're all exhausted and we all want to sleep. So he can sleep in our room now and we'll just get it worked out later. We'll have to deal with it and get him back in his own room later on once he's better.
Yeah, I mean, we've encountered that too. Once they're in your room, it's very hard to get them out, both dogs and kids.
Oh, yeah, right, exactly. And I try hard not to compare dogs and children, but I have to say sometimes sort of for these basic concepts, yeah, exactly. And it's sort of, I always say it's human nature and sometimes it's animal nature too, right? Like it's living things, and sleep and eat sort of principles apply. So yes, you said it, not I.
Yeah, no, I gotcha. Any other complaints that parents have frequently that you need to address?
I think we've kind of touched on the big ones and if I sort of run down through the list, one is making sure that parents know, and there's lots of good resources. The American Academy of Pediatrics has healthychildren.org as a website. I probably have some blogs I've written over the years on my own website, my drlaurajana.com. But make sure you know what normal sleep is, because it changes over time, right, with age and all. Take into account a child's behaviors, and sort of milestones and things like their developmental stages. When a child masters a new developmental stage, it could be standing up in the crib, it could be a new burst of language or walking. Sometimes that's accompanied with now they don't sleep well. And I liken that to being so excited about something that it's hard to get yourself shut down and going to sleep. So first, knowing what's normal patterns. The second is making sure your expectations fit with what that is oftentimes the cause of what people see as completely separate food problems, right? Because a child who's drinking a lot of milk, especially whole milk, because most kids under the age of 2 are still on whole milk, that really doesn't do well for your appetite, right? And as kids get to be the age of 1 and they switch over to a cup, so they don't drink as much typically out of a cup as a bottle, they end up naturally sort of cutting down the volume of milk they get, which then makes them more open to learning to eat and accept solid foods. For a child who has a sleep problem, right, so they haven't learned to sleep through the night, they're waking up at their light sleep cycles, and a parent interprets that as thirst and gives them an 8-ounce bottle. And this is where I hear a lot of parents will say to me, but they are thirsty because they drink the whole thing. What I've learned to say is, listen, I've never been served warm milk in my life, aside from hot chocolate, but never been served warm milk. But if somebody came to me in the middle of the night when I couldn't sleep and I was frustrated because I couldn't sleep, and they said, oh, you know what, I'm so sorry you can't sleep, here's a cup of warm milk, I might actually just drink it and go back to sleep, right? That doesn't mean that's what I needed or why I was up and crying. That is a mistake. And again, that one very closely ties to some of the sort of, they don't connect the two, but some of the picky eaters, won't eat anything, refuses food problems. It's because oftentimes those middle of the night feedings are really throwing off their calories and what they're getting, and they're not getting a balanced diet that way.
Okay. And their body has to digest that milk too, so that would interfere with them sleeping and recovering.
Yeah, and the other one, to get to your point, just when you say, what is the thing what are some of those things that people miss in terms of misinterpreting or missing the signs or something? The one that also comes to mind is thinking that a child who is hyper is not tired, because sometimes the most tired, fatigued child is the one that kind of goes into overdrive, right? From a brain standpoint, I would say it's almost like all the neurons start firing off, right? Because there's not as good control and stuff. And parents say, yeah, but they're not tired. And sometimes the ones who protest the most, who are the most hyper, are the ones who are actually quite tired. And that's true both at home and as somebody who owned a child care center for 10 years, I had 200 kids coming to my center, and the kids who had a hard time taking naps oftentimes were kids who were not used to even putting themselves or being put in the conditions conducive for sleep, right? They hadn't had a routine, and all you had to do is really just get them to be convinced that they needed to be on a cot and be quiet, right? They could do something quietly. And now those are the kids who would fall asleep so quickly, but they're also the ones who are bouncing off the walls saying they weren't tired. Misinterpreting that bouncing off the walls as believing them that they're not tired is a big mistake. Just like thinking that all kids who say they don't need a nap after the age of 3 don't, as opposed to some of them do and they just don't know how to do it well.
Yeah, I can hear echoes in my head of kids saying, I'm not tired, yelling and screaming. And obviously they are, so very good.
Yeah, so you can imagine exactly what I'm talking about, and that's where you just don't want to miss the cues that they actually are, but they, then you can feel bad for them, right? They're protesting really hard, and you know how tired they are, and you just need to find ways that will get them into a kind of an environment that's conducive, which is why I love reading books. You can use a quiet voice. They have to be quiet to hear it. It's nice and warm, and you can maybe have quiet music on or whatever you want to do, but to try to get them more in a mode where they actually are able to fall asleep.
All right, very good. So what are some resources for people? You mentioned a few, but let's summarize them.
Sure. So, I like to make sure, people tend to these days, they tend to like to go to the web. And so I'm happy recommending the American Academy of Pediatrics parenting site, right? The one that's geared towards parents and caregivers. That's healthychildren.org. There's also a really good site called kidshealth.org that's run by the Nemours Foundation in a children's hospital. My website has some blogs. It's not specific to sleep, but I've written on the subject, certainly, and that's drlaurajana.com. The other thing is, in the context, not everybody just says, hey, my child has a sleep problem, but in the context of newborns or feeding children or them learning skills, all of my books touch on the issue of sleep because it's so fundamental to everything else. So those are Heading Home with Your Newborn, From Birth to Reality. I've got a book about feeding kids, called Food Fights, Winning the Nutritional Challenges of Parenthood, but there's a section on bedtime routines and all. And then my newest book, The Toddler Brain, Nurture the Skills Today That Will Shape Your Child's Tomorrow. I talk about the skills that are going to serve kids well when they get to kindergarten and problem solving and getting along with others. But in every chapter, I address how sleep plays a role in developing those skills and how important it is. So there's lots of ways to find really good information about sleep, both specifically and then also as it relates to some of those common challenges. Like I said, I've addressed newborns, it always comes up, and then also with feeding kids and with getting them to be in a mode where they're actually in good shape to learn. None of us learn well when we're sleep deprived. I don't care how young or old you are. So that's the other angle to take.
Very good.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.